Hi, Kent. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine.
Good, good to see you, Aman.
Thanks. Me too.
And Marwan.
Usually,
Marwan from DS. Marwan is here. How are you, Marwan?
yeah, you know him?
Oh,
Okay. He's
oh
mute.
yes.
I have to give him
Oh, he's
permission
muted.
to
Oh,
talk,
okay.
so I will allow him
That's
the
okay.
mic. Okay.
No worries.
Hi, Grant.
Hello,
Long
Marwan.
time.
How are you?
Good to
Yeah,
see
hey,
you
I'm
again.
gonna be in Riyadh from Tuesday to Thursday next week. I'll give you a shout.
Please, I'll be in Riyadh as well. Give me a call.
Okay, I'll do that.
Let's get together for dinner or for lunch.
Sounds awesome. Let's do it.
Okay.
Hi, Grant.
Righty. Hi,
Shireen, how are
Shireen.
you,
How are you?
Shireen?
Yeah, fine. How are you?
Long time, Shireen. How are you?
Long time, Marwan.
Yeah, I'm back. The last month was, very busy.
So we see
Alhamdulillah.
you next Thursday, inshallah.
I'm trying my best, but please, my recommendation next time, try to make it on Wednesday better. Thursday, the last day of the week, I have to catch up and go back to Jeddah. But I'm gonna do my best to stay there.
Okay. So I think we can start softly. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good, Shireen.
Yeah, so I would like to welcome you, Grant. It has been a long time. This is our first webinar after the vacations and holidays and everything, Ramadan. So today we are happy to have you with us. Okay. So would you like just introduce everyone in the meeting? Would you just write for us where you're attending from? What is your background? What do you do? What's your company field? So it helps us to ensure we deliver the right message to people attending. Just like for myself, I'm Shireen. My background is engineering. I work as a consultant and I'm attending from Egypt or Saudi, wherever. So Grant from ATM, Dubai. Welcome.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. So who else? Yes. Yeah. We have some people. Yeah. Please start. Welcome.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it is a pleasure to be back. And thank you so much for having me after the holidays. It does feel like quite a while since we spoke last, but I think it was probably about 3 months ago, actually. But it's always a pleasure to be on the Symbios-Consulting webinars, which is every Saturday, almost every Saturday. And actually today's topic, or maybe just give you a bit of background about me first, just for the few people that are on the call, and I know this is recorded too, is I work with ASCM, the Association for Supply Chain Management, our very esteemed partner in the Middle East. Symbios-Consulting is one of our great partners that we work with. We do many ASCM projects with the organization. We do training, a little bit of consulting in the form of assessments and those kinds of things, but a great partner of ours, and yeah, we work very closely with them. So the topic for today's session is supply chain strategy, setting and following through. And this is actually quite a pertinent topic as things stand right now. A lot of organizations currently are feeling a little bit lost, right? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of risks and impacts on the supply chain currently. From geopolitical risks, there's war, there's many issues. We know the tariffs and things, which is like on again and off again. And all these things have an impact on the supply chain. So it becomes very hard for an organization to think about strategy, right? When we think of the word strategy, we think of this in terms of long term. This is years of a plan that we have in the organization. So it becomes difficult to imagine where our supply chain should be in the future. But what we're actually talking about here in terms of strategy is principles by which we should be running and managing a supply chain. And having a goal and objective is critical in order for us to develop the right plans, the right specific implementations of initiatives in the supply chain that can support a bigger strategy. Now, a strategy for the supply chain typically should fit in with the broader business strategy. So if we were to look at this from a diagrammatic perspective, we would see the business strategy comes first, whatever goals and objectives we have there, and that flows down into the supply chain strategy specifically. So there's a couple of topics, sort of an overview, first of all, of why is it that specifically supply chain, the discipline of supply chain within an organization, has such a strategic role. I was actually at a conference today about sustainability, and there was a statistic that was given at the conference about 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions are caused by an element of the supply chain, right? And it just shows you the impact from that perspective, even that supply chain has on the bigger organization. And many of the decisions that we make in the supply chain are internal to the organization's success. So we have a very big role and a very big impact. So the first reason why supply chain is strategic in an organization is because it provides us with competitive advantage. This is a concept that I think only recently has actually become clear, because people used to think of businesses as competing with each other on products, right? But actually, businesses are competing with each other on their supply chains. It's supply chain versus supply chain, not necessarily product versus product. And the reason why we're broadening this to supply chain is because a product has many elements to it. The product is also about where the product is, how much it costs, how quickly we can get it to the market, what other factors we need to consider when delivering a product to a customer. So the supply chain, in essence, is actually a competitive advantage for an organization. And this is one of the reasons why it should be seen as so strategic. It is an area of the organization that helps us to both reduce costs and improve customer service. And that definition is the definition of a supply chain. It also helps us to increase speed to market and really assist with any decision that relates to customer satisfaction and the market position. The next one is strategic alignment. So the supply chain translates a high-level business goal, a goal as broad as we need to grow, or we need to be lower cost, or we need to ensure that we are more focused on how close we are to the customer intimacy, into something actionable. And I think this is actually one of the reasons why I gravitated towards supply chain management as a discipline in my career, is because it's so practical. It's about how many boxes go into the warehouse. It's about how quickly we can do things. It's a very understandable concept. And being able to change a very fluffy strategy into something real is really where the supply chains can shine. So this really helps to bridge the gap between that sort of, we want to just be a better organization, into something that's actually executable. Then the next one that we have is responsiveness and agility. And we'll talk about responsiveness and agility in a little bit more detail as we go. But one of the aspects is that a supply chain within the organization is where we really need to make decisions and changes. So, you know, a common issue that we have is, oh no, we're running out of stock somewhere. We need to increase stock levels in a certain location. We get a sudden order from a customer. The place where that is impacted is in the supply chain, right? That's where we make those decisions and make the changes. The next one is innovation enablement. So a supply chain helps us to do product innovation. The product itself might have certain elements of innovation, but also how we deliver the product and certain elements around the packaging of it, for example, and things like that. So we could look at how we reduce lead time, how we enable rapid prototyping. So any sort of test product that is created, supply chain has a key role to play in that. Also aligning manufacturing and sourcing activities with the research and development, or the NPD process of an organization. That's new product development or research and development. The next is cost management and efficiency. So strategic supply chains help us to identify what the cost drivers are in the different elements of the supply chain. So you would have heard the concept of product lifecycle management. This is really looking at the end-to-end view of an entire supply chain across even multiple organizations. This doesn't necessarily only have to be within one company, and a strategy can even extend beyond the walls of an organization. But it really is about how we understand cost, how we understand the impact on sustainability, how we understand many other factors in the supply chain from end to end. And that includes even disposal of the product at the end of its life cycle. So this is where we can really see that view and the impact of different decisions across the entire network. So here's where supply chain really shines to be strategic and a strategic supporting function in an organization. The next is risk mitigation. So this one is going to be very applicable at the moment, right? Probably, I want to almost say since just before 2020, we started with a cycle of extreme risk, right? Many things happening all the time. And a lot of people think that this is a reason why we shouldn't have a strategy, or we should put less emphasis on a strategy. But actually what we should be doing is creating a strategy that helps us to mitigate risk. So every decision that we make is in a strategic way. And with the right strategy, supply chains can actually help us anticipate changes in demand, changes in supply, and actually assist us with buffering against the disruptions that we now see happening quite frequently. And then the seventh one we have is sustainability and our ESG goals. So this is where an organization can use its supply chain to improve environmental and social governance targets through things like responsible sourcing, greenhouse gas emissions tracking, and various waste reduction initiatives as well. So these are some of the strategic aspects within a supply chain contributing to an organization. So what is a supply chain strategy? If you were to write a supply chain strategy out, what would it look like? And I'd like to give you an example of 5 different supply chain strategies here. So the first one I have is, and this is a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's a lean supply chain. The strategy is to make our supply chain lean. What are the primary attributes that we have there? And we typically use the SCORE model, at least in my world. It's a very useful tool. It's not the only tool, but I would definitely recommend it. SCORE does help us to identify specific attributes, metrics, processes that can help us to actually create a strategy. And I'll show you a slide a bit later on in terms of how the SCORE model can actually help us do that. But some primary SCORE attributes for that strategy would be cost and asset management, right? Reducing the amount of cost in the supply chain and also assisting us with improving the efficiency of the assets that we have, things like machinery, inventory, and those kinds of things that fall within asset management for a lean supply chain. The description of that is that we're really focusing on efficiency, we want to reduce waste, and we want to help with cost reduction. An example of that could be a fast-moving consumer goods company that is trying to optimize inventory and transport to reduce the cost per unit. So this is following that specific strategy. The next one we have is an agile supply chain. Key attributes here would be things like responsiveness and agility. Responsiveness being how quickly we can get our product from order to customer, right? The speed at which we operate. And agility is how quickly we can recover from an unanticipated shock to the supply chain. So try and think what kind of supply chains you would want to have an agile supply chain strategy for. The description of this is really designed for speed and flexibility to respond to an unpredictable demand, right? That's simple. An example of this is a fashion retailer adjusting product lines weekly based on trends and demand signals. So think of like a fast fashion, right? Some celebrity wears a certain product, a certain designer, shirt or something like that at an event. All of a sudden, everybody wants it and we need to adjust quickly, right? So this is really where we would employ an agile supply chain strategy. The next one I have is a resilient supply chain. This is about reliability and about agility. Reliability is really about the predictability of that supply chain, on time in full, right? Or perfect order fulfillment. So really knowing that if we say that it's going to be delivered next week, Tuesday, the product is delivered next week Tuesday in the right quantity with the right quality of the product as well, so it's not damaged or anything like that. So this is really a supply chain that's built to handle disruptions and also to recover quickly. An example of this could be an electronics manufacturer that uses multi-sourcing and buffer stocks to withstand geopolitical shocks. So they've positioned strategically components of their product. Let's say it's a computer, right? And they assemble a computer. They would strategically position certain things in certain areas to be the safest and also to help buffer in case of any shocks that they might incur. The fourth one is customer-centric supply chain. Here, we'd also want to look at being responsive and reliable. This supply chain is tailored to meet specific service levels and delivery expectations of the customer. So now we're quite focused on what the customer needs. An example of a supply chain that does this could be an e-commerce company, right? So think of an online delivery organization that you go and you buy, like Amazon, that offers next day delivery with real-time customer order tracking. So the customer has visibility, they know where their product or their package is, and then they can get it on time when they've ordered it, and it really in a quick amount of time. So that's very customer focused. And then lastly, a segmented supply chain. So this varies by segment. So you could really have any score attribute here, and we'll dive a little bit into segmentation as well, because it is one of my favorite topics. And this is a different description or different type of supply chain design for different products, different customers based on value and needs. And you could really employ this type of strategy for a multinational firm that's using cost optimized supply chain for some legacy products and maybe a more agile model for some new products or some new product launches, for example, right, which might need a different strategy initially. So there are some examples of that. And actually what I will say is, by far, most supply chains in most reasonably advanced organizations would probably be taking a segmented supply chain strategy in some sense. They need to determine what size fits what segment of their supply chain. And this is not to be confused with a segmentation analysis that you would do within marketing, right? There you would look at customer segments, you would look at those kind of things. Whereas within a supply chain segmentation, we're looking at factors within a supply chain that make it unique. And I'll take you a few examples of that. So when we start to look at segmenting the supply chain, here are some examples of factors that we can use. So things like the strategic importance of that supply chain or that product. Things like the value or the profitability. So is it high value? Is it highly profitable? Is the profit margin quite high? What amount of products do we deliver? So what is the tonnage that we actually ship? Is it a high amount? Is it a low amount? Demand variability and supply variability. I think these two are some of the key elements here, because what we'll talk about later is what we do with the certain segments and then how we ultimately develop a operating model that can support demand or supply variability. So think of different products that you might have, right? A common product on a grocery shelf, like milk, bread, things like that, typically has a low demand variability. We know there's a certain volume that's going to be shipped. People need it. They buy it regularly. It's quite predictable, right? Whereas sort of a new type of electronic device might have a much higher demand variability, or something that hasn't got a lot of history in it, like a new product, for example, could be much higher in that. So we'd want to identify what products we have that are either high or low variability when it comes to demand, and we measure this through the forecast accuracy. So the more accurate we are, lower variability; less accurate, high variability. Supply variability is also another key one, right? And this is sometimes a little bit less under our control. We deem it to be less under our control, though there's many things that we can do to help improve that. But this is really about more on the supply side. Does the customer deliver on time, in full, regularly, or is there often issues when it comes to their deliveries to us, for example? So there could also be other risks like geopolitical issues and things like that that could affect it, maybe tariffs. and this would affect the supply variability as well. Geographic location is another one, where the product is located, where it's manufactured, brand or market type. So really just types of products or services that are grouped into different brands. So sometimes for convenience, we'd also want to make sure that we have a similar strategy for those types of products. And then also the customer type as well. You know, if you're shipping to a wholesaler versus a retailer versus an e-commerce, channel, these also differ quite a lot, right? So you'd really want to make sure that we list that as well in terms of the different attribute that could be impactful in the supply chain. So I want to give you this example, right? So this is really looking at how we segment the supply chain and already a practical view of that. So this is a clothing retailer, and in this clothing retailer, we have 5 different segments that have been created. The first one is fast fashion. So these are sort of hot items of clothing that are moving off the shelves very quickly. The next one is general fashion items. They have basics, right? Maybe socks and things like that, specialty products. And then what they've also allocated here is a manage or rationalize type of product as well, which is sort of like end of life. Think of a rack where you have a clothing store where it's like the end of the range, right, for the end of the season. They've also actually identified that specifically there as a channel, or as a certain segment in the supply chain. So what you can see there then is just in a very basic way, looking at things like margins. Is it a high or a low margin? Right, so the fast fashion and the fashion items, number 1 and 2, both they have a high margin. They're very profitable. Basics has quite a low margin, so less profitable. Speciality also high, and then the ones that we want to rationalize have a low margin, probably because they're being discounted so we can sell them off. If you look at volume, you can also see there the impact of volume, either high or low for those different elements. Predictability, which in this case we could also think about in terms of maybe supply or demand variability, and then a sourcing or manufacturing, which would be a low-cost country or regional sourcing or manufacturing source, right? Which is one of the ways in which they've defined their supply chain as well. Then if you look at the second table, we can see for each of those 5 different segments, the total share of sales that comes from each of those from a total value perspective, and then the share of the total margin, which would be from a total profit perspective. So where should we really be focusing, right? So the profit actually, if you look at this, the profit is sitting in basics, right? So 40% of the profit we make is in those basics products. And then what we have there is the value drivers. So what is important as a driver of the value in those different segments that have been identified? So if we look at the fast fashion one first, what's important there is that we have a quick design to shelf turnaround. So we design the product, manufacture it quickly, and get it on the shelf as soon as we can. That's a really important factor of that specific segment. Another one is the ability to test and chase. So ramp up markdown volumes, what we call chase, and really quickly based on the initial performance or the test that we do. So in this example, and I'll actually use an example where I worked at Avon, we used to do sort of like handbags and watches and those kind of items, which was kind of like a fashion item, but we would do a introduction into that, or sort of a soft launch. And based on that soft launch data, we could tell if this is going to be a big product or not, right? And use that to either ramp up the demand forecast and thereby the supply, or to take it down and maybe adjust the forecast down. So that's a way to do that, right? But these are value drivers for the fast fashion segment there. Then number 2, that fashion segment, they've said here they want to maximize the margin capture and minimize markdowns. So they really don't want to discount it. They want to try and keep it stable. And also they said hold back at distribution center, share inventory across the network, and push allocation to stores based on the actual demand. So they're holding the stock more at a centralized level. And then as demand dictates, they can ship products into the store level, right? So this is a clothing retailer. Under basics, which is number 3, key value drivers we have for that specific segment is that we want to minimize cost to serve logistics. So because it has quite a low percentage margin, we can see that the margin is low. You actually want to look at cost savings there. So try and not spend money on satisfying that logistics cost, right? So packaging, making sure we do maybe more bulk shipments, maybe the MOQ is a bit higher and things like that. Maximize in-stock levels. So ensure that it's available on the shelf for people to buy at different sizes, colors, and styles. And then robust forecasting and allocation logic. So the forecasting one is important there too. How do we ensure that we can forecast in a much more accurate way? Flow through, which is minimum maximum replenishment, and then high visibility to on-hand inventory levels. So being able to really have visibility and see what is sitting where in each of the shelves to make sure we have the stock on the shelf. Then number 4, the specialty items. So let's say it's like a special kind of belt or something like that. Maximize the margin capture and minimize markdowns again. Minimum outlet presentation quantity. So because these are less common items, we are not intending to hold a lot of stock at each retail location. And then hold back at distribution center and share inventory across the network. Those are key value drivers there. And then under the manage or rationalize segment, they've said they want to have a disciplined markdown management. So really cleverly marking down the product so that they can get rid of it eventually, but also make sure that they don't lose out on profit, right? And then stock keeping unit or SKU rationalization using cost to serve and maintaining margin economics. So it's exactly that. So you can see there's different value drivers, right, for these different areas. And what's then important is just to say, well, we can't apply the same approach for all of these because they are actually different. We have different value drivers for each of them. They provide us with different amounts of margins and profit. So we really need to think about what we're going to do next, right, in terms of managing our supply chain based on these different segments. So that's just an example for you, which shows how this organization actually did the segmentation in the end. So based on the SCORE model, this is a view of how SCORE sees strategic objectives. Okay, so what we have there is the attributes, and I mentioned these to you before. The attributes define the strategy. Is the strategy for reliability? Is it for cost? Is it for profit? Or is it even for social reasons? We need to decide that. And there is no right or wrong answer there, right? That's a decision that's typically made at an organizational level. And I almost want to lift that up beyond supply chain and say, this is a company decision, right? Are we aiming to be responsible? Or are we aiming to be agile as a company for that product segment or that supply chain segment? And therefore, what is the strategy that we need to take? And yes, there could be an element of many of these at once, but when we do these kind of exercises with organizations is we try to force a decision, right? We want you to be clear with what is the key attribute or the key strategy that you're trying to achieve. And it doesn't mean that the others need to fall away. It doesn't mean that we want to achieve a inferior performance on the others. But what it does mean is that we want to make sure that we have a way to know what is the key driver. We want a key driver because in supply chain management, there's always a trade-off, right? There's typically a trade-off between reliability and cost, right? The number one way that organizations improve reliability is they add more stock, they add more inventory. So if there's inventory there and a customer places an order, oh, look, we've got products available to sell. But that comes at a cost, right? It also potentially makes us less agile. So we need to consider everything as a trade-off. It's not one item at a time. Then as we move through this, as I mentioned, it's about choosing an attribute, right? So we have an attribute choice over there. So in this case, this organization has said reliability is very important to us. That is the strategy that we want to take. We want to have the ability to perform tasks as required, focusing on the predictability of the outcome of a process. And if you go to the right a little bit, we can see that there's a metric associated with that attribute. So a very common metric for reliability is called perfect customer order fulfillment. We also actually have metrics around perfect supplier order fulfillment and perfect return order fulfillment as well. So there's many metrics around reliability that we can look at. Within perfect customer order fulfillment, this is your on time, in full, correct documentation, and the product cannot be damaged and must be in good condition. So those are 4 elements that form part of the perfect customer order fulfillment. And what we see here on the right is a benchmark that we did using the target performance of an organization, looking at that company's specific metric, a number for that specific area, and then comparing it to different companies that are within the same pool of population as that organization, right? So doing a filtering process, understanding what similar supply chains there are, and then seeing which companies sit at parity, advantage, and superior, and what those numbers are. Parity would be the 50th percentile of the data, 70th at advantage, and then superior at 90th. And then the most important piece of that is the gap to target, right? So how far away are we from achieving that specific metric if we've chosen a specific attribute? And in this case here, for this little orange table, cost has been deemed to be the superior performance target. We want to be the lowest cost. However, we're currently sitting at an 8.1%. We want to be down at 2.4% if we're going to be at superior. That's the total supply chain management cost as a percentage of revenue. So we have a 5.7% gap, right? And now the task is, as we move into operationalizing the strategy, is to figure out what makes up that 5.7% and where we can start to impact and reduce the cost of those elements. Okay, so this is where we are with so far with our strategy. I then want to touch on the score model and how the score model can be used as a strategic tool. So the first step that we have here, and apologies for some of that spelling there, but what are the company's goals, right? So for example, growth, cost leadership, customer experience, those are some of the things that we discussed already. First, we need to do that. Then what we want to do is map the current supply chain processes, right? And you'll see these are the old score processes here. So actually, I'll just, for making sure we get the new ones in, is plan, source, transform, order, fulfill, return, and orchestrate is actually the current supply chain processes that we want to map. And using a model like SCORE to create a common language and a process view across the entire organization. Then, and I've bundled these two together, right? Technically, you want to align and segment the supply chain first, and then identify the strategic priorities. But sometimes you'll get a strategy that is more generic in the organization, and you'd want to filter that down into the different segments, or maybe create a version of that in the different segments. So it's just about choosing which score attributes matter the most, and then aligning and segmenting that to the supply chain itself. So this is where we need to develop specific initiatives that close those performance gaps. And these are different for every organization, right? These are not going to be the same thing in different companies. So ultimately, we want to align and segment the supply chain. We want to align based on customers, products, regions, and of course, the chosen score attribute as well. Okay, we like SCORE, so it's very easy to use. All right, then let's think about what happens next. So once we've determined, like you saw in that clothing retailer example, we've now determined what those 5 segments are, what's important in those 5 segments, and therefore what we need to do to make sure that our organization aligns to that. So this really depends on the operating model. So operating model is how we operate based on what decisions we have to take. So if you look at this diagram over here, this is an example, and this actually originally comes from a pharmaceutical company, by the way, but they put together this and said supply relationship management. These are the elements they need to consider. How we do supply chain network optimization, the value chain components as well, and the value proposition, organization, and this was just the term they used for the creation of the organograms and things like that. But essentially, how do we structure the company's the people within the organization and the different departments in order to best fit the decisions that we made from an attribute perspective. The other one was information and technology enablement. So a good example of this is usually, planning tools. So do we want to use a very high-tech machine learning, artificial intelligence forecasting module, or are we okay to just do statistical forecasting based on history, right? Many factors will determine that. The other decision is how we manage ERPs and things like that. So that's where that piece comes in. And then the governance and management system as well. That's also a key decision point that we want to take into account. Obviously, at the end, to go to the customer and ensure that they get what they need. In this case, it was the customer beneficiary, which was in this pharmaceutical product, because these were basically patients that they had. Okay. And then again, you'll see the old school model here, but still, I want to this is a very good diagram to really explain the point. And this really ties it in the end. So now that we know what we want to do with a specific segment, so imagine this is for only one segment of the supply chain, right? Maybe the fast fashion segment, or it could be for the for just the fashion items segment, right, that we saw in that example. So what decisions do we make in plan? Do we do a centralized planning or decentralized? So is that at the retailer specifically, or do we do that at a head office level? Is it demand driven or is it forecast driven, right? Making that decision as well. And also deciding which kind of technology we want to use. Under sourcing, do we have a global or a local sourcing strategy? This is also very, very pertinent if we think about how many suppliers, single versus multiple suppliers, because if you have a low cost strategy, having a single supplier typically delivers lower cost. You can get more economies of scale, right? So we can say, let's order our 100,000 units from one supplier and get a 10% reduction in the cost. Or we can hedge our bets, have 4 suppliers. It's going to be a little bit more expensive, but if one supplier cannot deliver, we have the option of another 3 that we can go to and we can get our product. So that really does reduce the risk. So let's say we're doing an agile supply chain strategy. Multiple suppliers is probably going to be something that we want to consider there. Under the make or transform, is it in-house or outsourced? So do we make it ourselves? Do we use third parties, contractors to make it? Is it flexible or is it fixed production? Again, looking at cost, right? Can we just make as we need, or do we need to think about a fixed production schedule and something that's going to help reduce cost? Under deliver or fulfillment, direct to customer versus distribution center. Another decision that we need to take, express versus economy, right? Do we want to, make sure that it gets there very quickly, and that depends on how the customer would react to getting their product sooner, or is it more about reliability? And then under the enable or the orchestration pieces about the technology platforms, performance management, what metrics we measure, considering the type of strategy that we have in place, what governance structures we put in place, and then anything else related to what you see at the bottom there, returns in the supply chain as well, and decisions around that too. So I'd like to leave you with that. That is just an overview of sort of starting to set the strategy. And of course, in real life, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But we need to think about what we want to do in our supply chains, right? And make the right decisions in order for us to implement them. So thank you so much for your time. Are there any questions that I can take from any other audience?
Thank you, Grant. You summarized a very complex topic in a very nice and easy way.
Thank you. I also didn't understand it for a few years as well, so I had to eventually summarize it for myself.
Yeah, I've been practicing it. I understand you had a big event in Dubai today as well. So
yeah, we did.
And next Thursday, you're going to speak in the Strategic Supply Chain Forum in Riyadh.
I'm looking forward to
it. Very busy.
Very busy, but it's all good because we want our supply chains to be successful.
Yes, of course. So any questions from anyone?
Yeah, I have question, Shireen. Thank you so much. And this
Please,
for
Marwan.
so today, Grant, so with the rapid change in the supply chain and the crisis we live in the Middle East, the U.S. tariff, another global crisis that caused, the entire global trade at risk. So today, which strategy do you think is the most convenient that can protect the business? Because today, what we hear in the news and the talks of the business people, it's no more about the U.S. tariff. It's about the global supply chain is at risk.
Yeah. One of the strategies yeah, go for it, Marwan. I'm sorry. I think you were still busy asking the question.
No. This, how can we protect? How we can protect our business where supply chain is involved? Okay, which strategy will help me? Will protect my business? Which strategy will lead me to end safely at my destination?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that is definitely happening with companies right now is they're tending to have a shorter time horizon for planning. So that they're definitely sort of reevaluating things, and it's almost on a quarterly basis versus an annual basis, right? So there's definitely a shortening in the time frame because we've seen such rapid change. The other component that I think is very applicable in this case is because of the high amount of supply chain risk that we now find ourselves in. It's about making sure that we try and mitigate the risk. So unfortunately, that does mean that there is most likely an impact on cost, right? In order for us to mitigate risk, to ensure we have product availability, we are seeing a lot more inventory holding, for example, right? It's actually even since COVID times, but also now, people are holding more stock because we don't know when we can get stock, if it's going to be at a higher price because of tariffs and things like that. So that risk is inherently making us do different things. But the point is that we should be looking at that from a decision perspective, right? It shouldn't just be a knee jerk. We need to anticipate that there is risk that exists. And in order for us to be able to mitigate that, we need to plan ahead. So let's think about the rest of the year, right? Do we think it's going to continue? There's going to be, abnormal geopolitical issues. There might be certain things in Asia that we need to consider, depending on where your supply chain is based, or where they're getting your raw materials from, or your components. So I would take that into account. And if we were to redefine a specific strategy, it's going to be the strategy of agility, and potentially of maybe some reliability as well. What can we do to be more reliable? So hedging the bets in terms of, if you're a manufacturer that sources components, maybe think about getting more suppliers. Maybe think about sourcing different suppliers in different countries, where in case something happens in one country, you now have another option to go to. So expanding the options. Again, this is going to be a cost impact, right? So I'd definitely say that's something that might need to be considered. I want to also talk to the question that's in the chat, because I think this relates to a very similar topic, but the tariffs, right? So what supply chains love is stability, is something that we know and we can predict. So the problem is less that we have tariffs. The problem is that we don't know if we have them or not, right? If we knew that the tariffs will be 30% from now on and that's it, it's not ideal, but at least we know. At least we can plan ahead. The problem is the flip-flopping of that, right? And I think that's where it becomes tricky. It does have a big impact on supply chains, as does any risk that we can anticipate. But I think this also calls for maybe a little bit out of the strategy discussion, but a bit more scenario planning, right? What is the impact at a tariff level of 40%? What would the impact be on our supply chain? Would we need to think about changes in terms of where we source things from, where we manufacture, how we get the product to the customer? It's about trying to anticipate it and potentially also making a playbook, right? COVID was a perfect example of this. Many organizations in their risk registers at the time didn't have it at all. In some cases, they hardly had an impact of, sourcing shortages. We should have learned from that, right? We should have put in place risk registers that maybe not define a specific risk, but it could define a risk in terms of what if the price increases? What if we cannot get our product from a certain source anymore? What would we do? And create scenarios and digital twins that I know Shireen loves as well, that can actually do sort of a prediction for us. What would happen if we change these 3 levers, and let's figure it out? That becomes a lot more important in today's day and age. Any other questions? I'm not sure if it's on my side, Shireen, but I don't think we can hear you.
Nothing. I think it's becoming very very complicated. So with the tariff situation, do you think it will continue? Do you think it will be taken out? Any forecast?
It's hard to say, but what I would do if I was sitting as a supply chain director right now is I would build in the possibility of the changes and at what level, right? And ensure that I have a plan B, plan C, and maybe even a plan D, right, in place. Because that's where, again, looking back at COVID, is where the organizations that succeeded were the ones that already had a plan in place and had alternatives and a playbook to handle those complexities. So that's definitely what I would say for that. So I would assume that it would continue. I'm going to say, I don't know, but let's make the assumption in our companies that it will continue, and the uncertainty will continue. And I think that's what we need to be prepared for.
Okay, so thank you for your time and your efforts. Okay, we loved having you as usual, Grant. Thank you for your participation and commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and thank you to the Symbios-Consulting team and to everybody else on the call. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great
Bye.
evening.
Bye-bye. You too. Bye-bye.